Special guest today. I am thrilled to bring our guest to you. We have Kendyl Crawford, who is Director of Virginia Interfaith Power and Light. We have Reverend Dr. Faith Harris, who is Chair of Virginia Interfaith Power and Light. And we have Duron Chavis. He's the founder of Happily Natural Day and the Building Resiliency Gardens Project. And he's a legend in Richmond, Virginia as a community organizer. And we are thrilled to have you here, especially during these difficult times with COVID-19. The Interfaith Center and Virginia Interfaith Power and Light, we work together. Interfaith Power and Light is a program of the Interfaith Center. We are pleased to bring resources to you from faith leaders, community leaders, and experts to address these issues and help our community thrive at this time. So I am very happy to turn it over to Kendyl Crawford.
So much, Roberta. Very excited to be on Virginia Interfaith Live this afternoon. So the purpose for this show today, we just want to talk about how faith, food, and resilience are integral to achieving climate justice. We want to talk to our special guest today to find out how faith communities and the broader community as well can invest in strategies for resilience centered around food, climate action, and neighborhood engagement. But first, this is very exciting because today is the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. And right now, there are folks all across the nation, households, congregations, all praying together for the nationwide Earth Day prayer. And so I would like to pass the mic, so to speak, over to Reverend Dr. Faith Harris to lead us in an opening Earth Day prayer for today.
Good afternoon, and I'm happy to be here on this 50th Earth Day, and let us all join our hearts and our minds together in prayer. And our prayer today is, we hold the earth. We hold everyone who suffers from storms and droughts intensified by climate change. We hold all species that suffer. We hold world leaders delegated to make decisions for life. We pray that the web of life may be mended through courageous actions to limit carbon emissions. We pray for right actions for adaptation and mitigation to help our already suffering Earth community. We pray that love and wisdom might inspire my actions and our actions as communities, so that we may, with integrity, look into the eyes of all living beings and truthfully say we are doing our part to care for them and the future of our children. May love transform us and our world with new steps toward life. Amen. Ashe. And may it be so.
Thank you so much, Faith. That was lovely. So to kick off our program for today, I just wanted to give our guests a little bit of time to introduce themselves. So first up, we'll have who you just heard from, Reverend Dr. Faith Harris. And she is, as Roberta mentioned already, the chair of Virginia Interfaith Power and Light. And if I could make a special request, Faith, I'd like for you to add to your introduction, how does faith, even interact with caring for the planet for you?
So again, good afternoon. Yes, I'm Faith Harris, and I am assistant professor of theology at the School of Theology, Virginia Union University. And I am the chair for Virginia IPL and vice chair for Virginia Interfaith Center. And I am just so very thrilled to be able to be part of this conversation today. Because for me, the environment, or as often in the Christian circles, we discuss it and talk about it as creation care, is critical and important to my faith and to my faith walk and my practice. As an environmentalist and a grassroots organizer, I'm concerned about what happens to the planet and what happens to the people who live on this planet, as well as all the living creatures of the planet. But I also am concerned about our faith and what it means to be a spiritual being. And for me, many years ago, I recognized the importance of the environment in my faith walk. It enhances my sense of purpose. It certainly gives us a sense of the aesthetics and beauty of our world. And it just makes it so much more meaningful and real, and adds a realistic understanding of what it means to be alive when you think about this earth is here not for only for us to use, but for us to be a part of and to take care of. We have our biblical narrative begins with this idea of caring for the garden and these humans being placed in a garden where they are responsible to care for the animals and care for the plant life and to till it and to recognize its value and its importance to them, but also to the Creator. And we end our story, if you're reading the biblical text, we end our story in a garden as well. And so it is so critical that we think about our faith in perspective and in relationship to the earth and in relationship to all the other creatures, as well as humans. I often say that show me how people treat nature, and I'll tell you what they think also of what it means to be human.
Thanks so much, Faith. So next up, our other special guest today, and I was very, very excited that he said yes to join us today, is Duron Chavis. He is the founder of the Happily Natural Day Festival. And Duron, I would especially request for your introduction if you could talk a little bit about the food system and how it's related to climate change and the different environmental problems that we're seeing all around us this Earth Day.
Thank you for inviting me on. My backstory, I'm an activist, by destiny, I guess. I was pulled into this work by virtue of being connected to community and circle of elders. And I always tell people, like, I didn't choose to start farming, right? It chose me. The work came by virtue of my elders being Black farmers and them working with me in community to try to address issues of lack of food security in urban communities. And by being with them and being brought underneath their wing, I just gleaned so much understanding and so much guidance in that regard. We had been doing Happily Natural Day for almost 3-4 years before we started meeting farmers, but immediately after, we immediately started building collaborations. I like to think that the food system is one of the first signs of structured civilization for human beings. I think whenever we look and see the signs of science, of math, of art, it is all predicated by communities being able to produce food, being able to aggregate food, being able to process food, distribute that food, and have some system of managing the waste from that food. So from my vantage point, food systems are the bedrock around which cities, towns, villages, nations, even governments, countries are built. I found myself at the intersection of food systems and racial equity everything that we've done over the last decade or so has been dedicated to building resilient communities through the fostering of healthy food systems that are owned and controlled by communities that have been traditionally locked out of the food system. So what I do now is I farm. I'm a grower. I advocate on behalf of communities, and I work with communities in order to help them have deeper levels of access to healthy food, but not just for the sake of eating, but also for the sake of economics, and also for the sake of, holistic health and wellness. That this is not just about, growing for the sake of making money. It's about growing for the sake of building and nurturing sustainable communities wherever we find ourselves. Yeah, so this is I'm honored to be able to be here and talk a little bit about that. I think that as far as food systems are concerned, on Earth Day, it's super important for us to be recognizing that, our current agricultural systems are a detriment to our environment. The way that we produce food has really pathological implications to our human wellness, and that the hyperlocalization of food production and the building of equitable systems for communities that have been marginalized by racism and white supremacy will help to foster a healthier environment, and the deconsolidation of the food system from, large corporate entities will also help to foster a healthier environment alongside regenerative practices in the production and waste management of said food.
Thanks so much, Duron. So I know I've seen some studies that say that agriculture and I think other land use accounts for about a quarter, 20-ish% of our carbon emissions, which is a whole lot because when you think about the scheme of things. So this is a really big sector that we should focus on in terms of trying to figure out, number one, how we can make it sustainable for the planet, but number two, how we can also make it sustainable for people. So on that note, I'd like to dig in a little bit more into one of the concepts that you just mentioned, Duron. And Faith, please feel free to jump in here too. It'd be nice just to kind of get a conversation going. But I'd like to ask, how can food systems perpetuate injustice? You mentioned a little bit about, white supremacy, racism. How can the environment be, racist? How can that show up in our food?
Faith, because I could go all day. Maybe. Well, I'll say this. If we go back to the Plantation Era, when Africans and indigenous people were forced to work the land, one of the earliest examples of detriment to the environment was monocropping, right? So the monocropping of tobacco and cotton in the South stripped soil of the nutrients and minerals that were necessary to grow anything else, right? And as a result of that stripping of the soil of its nutrients, people were put in really detrimental predicaments in terms of having healthy food to eat, because you couldn't, as you planted this tobacco over and over and over and over again, and this cotton over and over and over again, you couldn't grow anything else in that soil. You had to figure out, they had to lay fallow. So that's one example. And that, as a result of that, in Virginia in particular, it changed the way the economy worked. So it was no longer folks were growing tobacco and cotton as cash crops. Then African people became, the crop, or the breeding of African people became, the economic windfall for plantation owners, right? So that's one example. Another example is the way that the consolidation of food into large corporate entities. What it has done is they're only producing, corn, soybeans, right? Those are the main crops that are being grown by these large farmers in Virginia. So in moments of crisis like we have now in terms of COVID, we have all of these tracts of land that aren't growing food, but they're growing corn and soybean, but it's more so for to be turned into biodiesels and turned into sugar, they turned into oil and things like that. Not food that you can, like, I'm gonna go to this farmer and I'm gonna go buy some corn. It doesn't work like that. So now we struggle with finding small farmers and them having the supports necessary to really produce food that can sustain regions at one time. That's the human impact. In terms of the environmental impact, the use of fertilizers, NPK, and its impact on our waterways is a real detriment. The runoff from the heavy fertilization of these major farms causes pollution inside of our Chesapeake Bay, and that affects what we drink, the water we drink. So that's one environmental impact. We could talk about the production of beef and how that has environmental impacts in terms of carbon emissions. We could talk about the transportation of food from other places coming into our communities and how the trucking industry is releasing so many carbon emissions in order to get food to urban centers. We could talk about the plastics that are used in order to package the foods and how that ends up inside of our waterways, and it affects our sea life and our seafoods, and how that also affects the water cycle. There's so many different layers to this thing, man. It just depends on what vantage point and what part of the system you live at. The clear cutting of forests, instead of using agroecology methods in order to maintain forests, creates situations where you can see the Amazon being cut down in mass in order to produce toilet paper and things like that. So, it's Abra. Oh, I'm sorry. It's a friend of mine from APGA who just tuned in.
Hi, Abra.
There's a lot of different ways that this agriculture impacts the environment in negative ways, but we're not going to be doom and gloom. We're going to say, okay, it's time to do regenerative agriculture, right? It's time for us to use, waste from our vegetable scraps and put that into composting so that we can sequester carbon. We need to talk about the planting of more fruit trees and orchards in order to, and nut trees in order to not only get production from nuts and fruits, but also to keep water in place, to keep it from being stormwater management issues in our community. We talk about open grazing our beef, and other livestock, so that them doing their business on the farms and rotating them through our cropland can help boost the nutrient density of the food that we eat. I mean, there's a lot. I'm just going to leave it there because it can get real deep, and I don't know how much time we have.
Hey, Faith, would you also like to respond to that question? Just thinking about how our food systems are also perpetuating injustice.
Well, obviously I'm not a farmer. I'm just a mere gardener. But I think certainly Duron has given us the agricultural farming and a sense of what that means and what could be, right? He's given us a vision for what could be. and what we're not doing. I think that the one thing that I could add to the conversation is just the reality that from a spiritual and a faith perspective, that we ought to be thinking in different terms about our relationship to our land and to our food and to our what it means to be alive and what it means to be human on this planet and what it means to be in relationship to the earth. And so when we think about the problem, right, the problem stems with a mindset, a moral mindset that does not recognize that the earth as a creature has a right to be, and that in that right to be is given to it in the same way that we have our right to be given to us by our Creator. And so that when we can't really make the shift to thinking about how we undo some of the harm that we've done as far as our agribusinesses and these large mass production farms, and even the way that we think systematically about our food system and all of our systems, all of the things that we have filtered into this mindset that has to be, we have to get the most out of, the most profit out of a particular entity or a particular system. That we recognize that it starts with a relationship, an interdependent relationship with our Creator, with our the creation, and with ourselves. And that if we aren't thinking that way, we can't get to the place where Duron would, where people like Duron can help us figure out how to do it until we change our minds to do it. And I think that's one of the things that the church and faith organizations like Virginia IPL and Virginia Interfaith, our Muslim brothers and sisters have just beautiful vision of the relationship to living things. Many of the faith traditions outside of Christianity also do as well. And so, I want to call on clergy and thought leaders and faith leaders and theologians and ethicists to be thinking about how do we change the narrative, change the moral narrative, change the theological narrative, so that we are actually recognizing the importance of our responsibility and our interdependent nature with interdependent reality with nature. And so, we as Christians, as a Christian ethicist and theologian, I have to take more responsibility in some ways, because it was the Christian church that started this, right? We got 500 years of the Christian church's narrative on, subduing the earth, not caring for the earth. And so, whenever I meet somebody like Duron, or we have a brother in Maryland who's one of our graduates who's also doing this same kind of work with food security. Whenever I meet them, I get beside myself with excitement about what they're able to offer the community, what they're able to offer individuals, but what they're really how they're offering and how they're working towards creating community, a community that gets it, that understands that we are all in this together, and that if we don't, we're watching it fall apart in front of our eyes with the COVID-19. We see the fissures, we see the problems. We hopefully will. I heard something today that said, hopefully that when we return, that we're not trying to return to normal. We need a new normal. We need a different perspective and a different take on what it means to be, creatures of this earth and part of the larger ecosystem that actually is the earth. Like we are the earth, and if we don't care for it, we will lose it and us.
It's not disconnected from us.
That's right. Yeah.
Exactly. And that's an important message to talk about. I'm going to emphasize today on Earth Day, Now I
Mhm.
see a question that someone asked, and maybe Duron, you have an idea here. How many Black farmers are there in Virginia, and what more could we do to support small farmers?
So I'm gonna answer that question, and I'm gonna start it by saying in 1920 there are over 230,000 Black farmers in Virginia, and 2000 and I think 12 or maybe 16. Within the last 10 years, there were less than 2,000 Black farmers in the state of Virginia. Now, that just also to say that in Virginia there was only 44, I think it was like 40,000 farmers in the state of Virginia. So the Black farmer population was less than 4% of the total of Virginia farming population. But just when you do the math in terms of how many farmers were in Virginia in the early 1920s to now, it can help you kind of understand like the dispossession that has occurred in terms of Black farming in the Commonwealth. And it's not by accident. There's also, a long line of USDA discrimination, systemic racism that has sucked Black land and Black farmland away. Also, some policy stuff as it relates to like air property. So it's a lot of different things that have contributed to the loss of Black farms and Black farmers. But when you say supporting small farmers and Black farmers, those are two different conversations. Because when you say small farmers, it's like all the farmers, and there's a lot of different things that you could do, on an individual level. But there's systemic things that need to happen in order to also shift the dynamics for small farmers and specifically Black farmers. So one of the things that I would advocate for is we need deliberate and intentional changes in air property policy, because what happens is that if the property has been left to multiple heirs and they can't agree on the use of the land ends up going into probate, and then it ends up going back to the state and auctioned off, and that farmland that was in Black hands can get snatched away. That's just a very clear policy. A lot of people are working on that, but we need more advocacy in that room. Another thing that is really important is, even though the Pickford case really was a really amazing investment and with the largest class action lawsuit paid out specifically to Black farmers. It did not touch all of the farmers that existed, because everybody didn't get into the room when it came to filing for the class action suit. Well, some of the issues that have not been fixed is, access to equipment. Farmers are still being discriminated against in terms of loans. I know personally farmers that have been given bad loan products and have been discriminated against for funding for their farms from the USDA. So there needs to be more hyper focus on how race impacts people's access to capital in order to farm on a large scale. Then, I would just keep it funky with you, man. Like the conversation about land access is a real issue. We think about gentrification in terms of urban centers, but the same thing is happening in terms of rural farmers all over the country, and particularly in Virginia. Another element that needs to be dealt with is access to supply chains. One of the earliest engagements around urban farming that I had was farmers telling me that, hey, I don't have time to, really develop these relationships in terms of access to markets, in urban centers. They could grow food really well, and maybe they had some cooperative actions happening with other farmers. But in terms of getting produce directly to consumers or getting it to restaurants or to third-party vendors like, school systems and, assisted living facilities and cafeterias. They just didn't have the time and the energy to do that. So, as we as city dwellers and people in this in the inner city, we need to be thinking about how we can fill those gaps and support those farmers and getting connected to those spaces, and also developing other elements of the food system that can support the farmers who are doing the production. So, a lot of people just think about farming and think it's just production. It's not. It's also distribution. It's also processing. You know what I mean? It's also waste management. So when a farmer farms and grows his food, like who's he selling it to? Is he selling his stuff to a food hub that's aggregating his produce that can then sell it to, the school system or a cafeteria or a college or, something like that? And we the answer to that is often not. We're not thinking about the other elements of the food system that are necessary. So small farmers need that in general. Black farmers need that specifically because they've been locked out of those channels for so long. So yeah, that's a large question. There's some direct action stuff that folks could be doing, but there's also some public policy that could be changed. I advocate for both happening at the same time. And, if you have entrepreneurial spirit, there is room for you to get into this movement around aggregation of produce. There is room for you to get into this movement around development of commercial kitchens for the development of value-added products. That's the type of scale that is necessary to support the farmers. I mean, you buying a CSA from the farmer is amazing, but unless everybody buys a CSA from the farmer, it's really not going to make a dent. They need to be making, large tonnage. I mean, we were moving at one point produce from Petersburg, Virginia to Washington, D.C. in the back of a van. And if we were doing that with like 300 pounds of peppers, on a Wednesday night, imagine if we multiplied that times 50, you know what I mean, for one farmer. That's the type of.
And Duron, could you let us know what a CSA is?
Oh yeah, sorry. A CSA is community supported agriculture. Shout out to Booker T. Watley, who's one of the pioneers, African American farmer who kind of push for farmers to develop memberships for community, for them to purchase shares of their harvest, right? Way before anybody else was doing that, we were doing that. And it started out with like pick your own. You can come out to the farm and pick your own produce and things like that. But anyway, a CSA is basically now you go to the farmer, you purchase a portion of his harvest, and you pay that man up front or in installments over the season, and he delivers product to you for you to pick up, or it'll come to your house however he decides to do it. And that makes sure that he gets his money on the front end.
Thanks so much for that explanation. So I want to dig into another one of the things that you just mentioned, which is, how can folks take action? Like I know one of the most high impact ways to make a difference in terms of reducing your carbon footprint is just by reducing the amount of meat that you're eating, by eating more veggies. So what are some initiatives that you want to share with folks that they can plug in with? And, why is advocacy, why is civic engagement, why is collective action even important? I don't know which Faith or Duron who wants to start off, but I'd love for both of you all to let us know what you think.
I'll give it to Faith. Faith, you want to chime in? I don't want to talk all the time.
Oh, okay. Well, I think that civic engagement is obviously important because of all the things that Duron just shared with us. First of all, the policy issues that most people are completely unaware of, the kinds of ways that Black farmers and small farmers are locked out of the system, right? And so we're getting an education from Duron right now about what is needed and what are some of the policy issues that maybe we as activists and people who care about our food system and who care about our farmers, we want to see them thrive. We'd like to see good, healthy sustainable farming practices, and oftentimes small farmers are already doing that, right? So it's not something that they have to relearn. I think civic engagement is obviously important for those reasons, for the policy reasons, but it's also about advocacy and education. Conversations like this help people understand better where food comes from. That it just doesn't show up in the grocery store. That people are on the other end working and planning and strategizing, trying to figure out how to make a living, as well as to do the good work of farming. I think when Duron first talked about it was in his blood to be a farmer, right? It was his destiny. I think that most farmers talk about food that way. They talk about their work that way. They do it out of passion, out of love for the food, for growing, for the earth, for getting their hands in the soil. I think that that's a critically important aspect of what we ought to be doing, is educating children, educating adults, educating. Well, most of our seniors already know how this happens, but clearly there has been some loss of community knowledge and wisdom about food and about how we take care of ourselves and our planet and take care of each other. But I think, and I forgot the rest of the question, but I think that mainly the importance of civics is, it's about justice. If we're not watching, right? If we're not watching, if we're not as citizens paying attention to what's happening policy-wise, politically, economically, bad things happen. And it's our responsibility as people of faith, as people, as citizens, to care about what's happening around us, and to ensure that there's justice and equity built into the policies and laws that govern our state and govern our industries.
Thanks so much, Faith. Duron, same question. What are some initiatives that you can share with folks that they can plug in with? Maybe you can talk some about your really exciting project that you have going on right now.
Yeah, so there's a lot of different things. So I'm looking at these questions on the side too. So I'm trying to interweave how people can get involved and try to answer some of the questions that are coming up. So right now we're working on what we call the Resiliency Garden Initiative, where we're supporting communities through the development and through the building and delivery of raised beds to connect people to higher levels of food security during the time of COVID. It's a response directly to the need for folks to practice social distancing. Me personally, I have high anxiety going to grocery stores. It feels like I'm walking into a minefield. And there are a lot of folks that are not only have been furloughed, or laid off from their jobs. We know that even if you get food stamps, that's not enough. So how do we, get people the tools that they need in order to get as much healthy, fresh fruits and vegetables inside of their diet as possible? And we thought that one of the ways would be to actually give people raised beds. So you can go to our website and apply or get scheduled for a raised bed to be delivered to you. We have a core of volunteers that are practicing no physical contact with the folks. That means that they're dropping off wood, dropping off soil, building raised beds, giving people seedlings, and they're just doing it by text and phone. Folks that are at the home are just letting folks know where they want the raised bed. And if you don't have a home that you can put a raised bed in, we're connecting folks to faith-based organizations, churches, as well as city property that they can then take on and grow in place there. There was a comment, a question, or thought on here. Somebody asked about farmers markets. Right now, farmers markets are unallowed. You can't use a farmers market during COVID because it's way more than 10 people in place. But even before, there were those stay-at-home orders from the governor, we knew that farmers markets didn't exist in communities of color. Farmers markets predominantly exist in middle-class white neighborhoods. And, there was the expectation for those communities of color were supposed to travel to white neighborhoods in order to participate in farmers markets. So I ain't trying to say that that's a bad thing. I'm just saying that that's not excess. That's not accessible. Um, they also, but at the same time, farmers markets are a great place where great places for farmers to connect with their core audiences and do their deliveries of their CSAs and also make sales. So it's kind of like, how do you figure it out? What we used to do is and what we will be redoing is we would connect farmers specifically to census tracts that had limited access to healthy food, and we'd sell produce directly inside of those neighborhoods. Now, we would love to connect and get that going with other people in other places. We could talk more about that. But there was another comment about immigrant farm workers that don't have access to food and water, but they help provide for this state. Yeah, that is a hell of a question. That speaks to, the system that has been put in place. So one of the things that I try to explain to people is that once slavery was over and sharecropping, once the Great Migration occurred and Black people moved out of the South, those plantation owners and corporations, what they did is they basically replaced Black hand labor with Latinx labor. So, what we saw when Black people moved out of the South is that the immigration laws, there were folks from the global South that were brought in to take the place of that cheap labor. And, how do we change that? I mean, Jesus, that's a great question. I don't know. Like the system of America, your agriculture is reliant on cheap labor. So I think that you're going to have to ask, all of us are going to have to answer some questions. Are you prepared to pay the real cost of food? You know what I mean? Right now, I don't think many of us are ready to pay the real cost of food. If our farm workers were being paid the wages that they deserve in a capitalist system, that means that the prices are going to raise for the food that you buy, and that goes for your strawberries in December. So I don't know if those are some really rough questions that you're going to have to pose to your politicians. That's the public policy question. Another piece of that is also going back to another comment that was about indigenous people, and the fact that this land was stolen from the indigenous communities. And I'll tell a story about going to what's the church? Reveille Church in Richmond, Virginia, one of the oldest religious institutions in Richmond, Virginia. So Reveille was formerly indigenous land that was bequeathed by King George to white colonists. And I'll never forget going to that space and they saying that King George gave 50,000 acres of land to these colonists to farm on. So that's the original sin in this country, and nobody's ever undone that. So, how are we navigating all this land talk? I mean, to be honest, the land talk that needs to really be had is like, well, how do we address the fact that the first families of Virginia made all this wealth off of stealing land from indigenous people, and we live with the after effects of that. Yeah. I mean, indigenous people got first dibs on all this because this is theirs from the jump, and they've been marginalized. But at the same time, when it came to the sale of land, even when Black folks bought land, and other ethnicities bought land, it was stolen from them. I don't know the experience of Latinx because that's not my background, but I can say that I'm sure that the same phenomenon that occurred to Black people occurred to Latinx people as well as indigenous people. And indigenous people, I don't like to play oppression Olympics. You know what I mean? To say, okay, well, the indigenous people had it worse than Blacks, or the Latinx had it worse, or whatever. We all have been pimped, smacked around, and jumped up and down on by white supremacy, racism. So at the end of the day, it makes more sense for us to figure out strategies of solidarity. And shout out to my homie Fix Kane from Alliance for Native Seed Keepers here in Richmond, Virginia, who are doing an amazing job in restoring indigenous foodways through the saving of seeds. He has been a collaborator with us in providing access to indigenous seeds. So that's the strategy that we've been using. We're trying to figure out how do we access land. So I'm trying to, I work on the land trust, the Maggie Walker Community Land Trust, and one of my goals is to make sure that we can get large tracts of land available for communities of color, specifically Black people, Latinx people, Indigenous people, so we can do what we want to do and practice self-determination on land in our communities that's protected legally. Hopefully that could be upheld in court or whatever the case may be.
One other thing that I wanted to add to that in terms of projects and in terms of what like churches can do. Oftentimes churches are owners of land, particularly in the African American community. It is they have land that could be used for gardening, farming, to create food systems within the community. And we have a church right here in South Richmond, Second Baptist Church, that has done that, and they are actually an urban farm. They're listed as an urban farm, and they're growing food, fruit trees. They have all kinds of produce there. And I think that if we could get churches and faith organizations they don't always have to be churches, but any kind of faith organization that owns land, to use their land for more than just parking lots, to actually use it for places to grow food. And even if they don't have a membership that's interested, but to allow others to use their land for that. I think that those are some ways that individual churches and communities can come together and create this sustainability. I really appreciate the conversation around what does it mean to be on this land that in fact actually belonged to people who were here, and we are inheritors of it in some ways, because we're here now. We were brought here, not just people of color, but people who have immigrated to the United States now after the fact, after the Great Sin. Well, do we have to continue to uphold that sin, or can we undo the impacts of it by actually building in equitable, just policies that can actually create communities that are able to have access and to be able to share in the wealth and the beauty and the produce together that this land has offered so many generations. It's not always about, I don't think this conversation is necessarily about building wealth or as much as it is about building community. And wealth is part of community, but the idea is that, it's not necessarily to rival what has been, but to create something new that's regenerative for all of us. And that, I think, is the beauty of this conversation. That's the beauty of the work that Resiliency Gardens has potential to do for all of us.
Thank you so much. So I would like our guests here to think of their last few final words. I just want to highlight some resources that are available on the Virginia Interfaith Power and Light website. So our discussion today has been about food, and I just want to share that on our website we do have a Rethinking Food for Faith Communities guide, just to assist faith communities that are starting to think through the process of, okay, how can we live more sustainably through the food choices that we make. Also, because this is Earth Month and Ramadan is starting very soon, very excited that we have available a Ramadan Creation Care calendar, and it's available for download right now on the VAIPL website. In addition, because Ramadan is also starting this week, we're having a webinar on Friday at 11 a.m. that'll talk about, what is Ramadan? What does Islam say about caring for the planet? So I'm hoping that folks will join us for the webinar on Friday. And then last but not least, so Faith just mentioned the importance of voting. And so I also want to encourage all of you to go to the VAIPL website and to take the voter pledge. We know that it's very important, that one of the ways that we're protecting the earth is by showing up at the polls. So with that, I will just leave. I will leave it to Faith and Duron. Can you just share maybe your last 5 words, 10 words that you want to leave us with? And again, a big thank you for participating today.
Final words. I believe in interdependence, and that the work that we do in community, our lessons from Mother Nature are rich and robust and widespread. When we take a look outside and we see plant communities that are biodiverse, how can we become biodiverse in our social interactions, racially, around class, gender, identity, religion? How can we work together symbiotically to build the strength of all of us? I believe that that's a lesson that Mother Nature is teaching us in this moment. This is what I'm seeing in terms of the work that we're doing with the Resiliency Garden Project. People from all faiths, people from all backgrounds, age classes, all types of folks just supporting each other to build a stronger community is what we're experiencing. And it's magnificent. It's the most beautiful thing that I've experienced. Ironically, it would be happening during such, a very challenging time such as this COVID-19 pandemic. But nonetheless, I believe that that's, when we really see the strength of community is during the times of crisis. How do we pull together and how do we create, strategies that support the least of us? Like how do we create a situation where the folks that have been overlooked and marginalized can get access to the things that they need and thrive? So thank you for sharing your platform with me. And if anything you hear from me today is that I believe in interdependence.
Yeah, I want to ditto the idea of interdependence and interconnectedness. And I think that the one thing that COVID-19 is teaching us is that our breath is even connected, right? And to not to necessarily it's a negative right now because we're sharing the COVID-19 virus when we breathe. But I think that is a lesson from nature that we are connected. And that what we do impacts everyone else. What one does impacts everyone else. And so, and that seems to be the way that the creation was made for a purpose, to help us all to recognize the importance of each and every entity in this creation. And so as we, try to navigate this time of pandemic and celebrate 50 years of Earth Day, the one thing that we can take, I hope that we will take from this experience is that we're all in this together, that we rise and we will fall together. And until we unlearn the very negative lessons of inequity and white supremacy and racism and xenophobia and sexism and all the things that hold us back from being with and for one another, we will not find that the goodness of the earth as a blessing that it was intended to be, but we will instead find negative consequences. And I think that we can all do this together if we choose to, if we change the way that we think about the world, think about one another, and if we get out here and just really serve each other, serve the earth, and let's celebrate Earth Week together this year by keeping our social distance, but staying connected at recognizing that we're all one, and that's going to make this world a better place, and that's going to make it possible for us to live sustainable lives and to be resilient.
Well, I could not think of a more powerful note to to end this, then we are all one. Again, thanks so much to all of our viewers out there. Thank you, everyone who left comments, who asked a question, and just much appreciation again to Roberta and Faith and Duron for joining us today. With that, thanks so much for joining this episode of Virginia Interfaith Live. Hope to see you this Thursday for the next one.